But now we are going to unmute Teos and get to our main topic today here on Mastering Dungeons. And that topic is DMG Part 3 of Chapter 8, Running the Game. So why are we doing this, Teos? Well, we've had all of this talk about where can we find stuff about foraging and where can we find stuff about gambling, and well, this is the running the game section, so this is where things like that maybe could be or should be. Parts 1 and 2 we've already covered, and now I think we're going to finish today. I think we can do it. We are going to finish chapter 8 with part 3, talking about combat and chases and siege equipment and more and more and more. So let's get right into it with combat. The first thing we talk about here is tracking initiative. What did you think of this section?
It felt to me a little bit dated. Like this was something that I would have expected to have read in maybe even a fourth edition book or third, because it felt like this is what people would talk about in third edition as being new. Like, ooh, you can have a piece of paper with the order on it, or you can have a visible list that's, like on a magnets that you move around, or wet erase marking things that you do, or you could have index cards. I'm like, these are all things we did in third edition. Um, and they didn't mention things that are like initiative cards that they give out with the numbers that even are in their own kits now. Weren't at the start of, they weren't out there in 2014, but they've added to the Dungeon Masters, what's it called, the Wilderness kit and the Dungeon kit, have those, or table tents with initiative on them, right? Or table tents with initiative on them that you put along the top of your DM screen. So all of this I thought was sort of, it felt a little, it's fine, it's a little dated. They also don't talk about sort of, they hint at it a bit, but they don't really say like, what is it you're trying to do with initiative? And what you're trying to do with initiative is speed play up. And the reason a lot of these different technologies have come in over time is because what you're trying to do is to let players know tactics without slowing things down to ask you, how long till the monster goes, right? Or does Sue go before I go this turn? Did she just go? I can't remember. All those kinds of questions, the more that it's clear to someone, the better that they can prepare for their turn. They can be aware of all the tactics involved, right? I'll do this so you can close the door. That'll be before the monster acts, right? All of that. You want that to be available. And it could have done a better job of talking through that.
Yeah, I agree. I wasn't upset with what was there, because for new DMs, you just need to know, hey, is there an easy way to do it? But yeah, what needed to be said, I think, was, and it was mentioned very briefly, which was, if you
Mm-hmm.
hide initiative, you could surprise people. It can be fun, but you're gonna then have to wake someone up when it's their turn, when otherwise they would know.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing that I've seen lots of 5e players or DMs do is play a different game and see this new unique initiative system for this other game and say, oh, I'm going to use that in my game because it was so fun to have that popcorn initiative
Mm-hmm.
thing where it was, and then it just doesn't work for 5e, because of 5e is a game that relies on the same order from round to round to round.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so it's might be important to just mention that.
That's
Uh,
true. Yeah.
yeah. Next, we get to tracking monster hit points, and we didn't really get a lot of detail from some of the things earlier in the chapter or even earlier in the book, and then tracking monster hit points goes into great detail. Uh, like, okay, you have 3 ogres. How do you differentiate between those 3 ogres while you're keeping their hit points? If you have minis, use different minis. If you're doing theater of the mind, describe each one with the scar, one with the broken club, and the other one, wearing a pelt of a lion. And that's how you differentiate between the three, which is fine. It's good advice. It's like, where did that detail come from?
Yeah. Yeah. It's good. Again, this is stuff that really was used a lot in third edition. And you could see that if if they thought about fourth edition, they might say, like when you have a condition, add a visible indicator to it, right? Whether it's to
Yep.
the initiative tent or to the miniature. And they chose not to do that, which I thought was interesting. And they have some nice references here, like, players will often ask how hurt a monster looks. Don't feel as though you have to reveal exact hit points, but maybe it makes sense to talk about the visible wounds and how beat down they are. And I think that's great. That's totally on point. It made me think that, boy, I wish they'd talked about how to answer questions about what the monster does, which is something that came up a lot, especially at the beginning of fifth edition, where because of
Yeah.
fourth edition, people wanted to make knowledge checks to know
Mhm.
that this thing is invulnerable to something or resists something or whatever it is.
Yeah, and that's a huge question in even with the most veteran game masters, everyone has a different opinion on how it works. And even people's opinions will change as they move from one group to another, where they think they have the perfect system. And it was the perfect system for the questions and the play style of their group. Then you go over to this group, and the same system that you thought worked well just completely breaks down with this group of players who will make 72 knowledge checks if you let them to get every last detail about a monster even before they want to roll initiative. So it's a strange topic that could have its own chapter of a book maybe,
Yeah.
but it is important to think about. And since the game doesn't exactly specify how it should play according to the designers.
Yeah, and then this next section about using and tracking conditions is interesting because again, they don't talk about the miniature angle or anything like that, or physical. They do. They don't really think about the opposition side of it. They do have some nice
Mhm.
advice for the players, that you can say like, okay, you can give the players a card that states what the condition is. That way, they remember because it's on top of their character sheet that they've got this condition to overcome. But they don't talk about how to and that on the monster side you could have a card that you mark on, but it doesn't say how you'd let the players know that and remind them of that, and that's an important interplay to consider. And it may be that you go like, no, I'm fine, I don't need to do that, or I'll remember, or it's not a big enough factor that I care. That's fine if you feel that way. But for those who want to think through this, it's good to give some options of how to illustrate that, and how important it can be, because it really is helpful to say to players, okay, you're going to attack one of the orcs. Are you attacking the one that is prone?
Mhm.
And just even and to talk through things like what to reveal, right? Like you might think as a DM, like, well, I don't want to tell the ranged person making range attack that they are attacking a prone target. They'll find out and they'll deal with it. But that's less fun, right?
Mhm.
More fun is to say, now that one's prone. Do you want to attack it even though you'll be at disadvantage because you're using a ranged weapon? No, no,
Mhm.
I'd rather attack the one. Okay, great. That's actually more fun in play. And those kinds of that kind
Yeah.
of advice can be really good in this section.
Yeah, and it's funny because those of us who lived through fourth edition know that conditions were a huge part of that game, and tools were made specifically for little paper clips or little rings, or people would use pop cap, the
Uh huh.
little stuff that comes off the pop cap and hangs there, of
Goodies
all different
hairbands.
colors, hair bands, rubber bands. But even then, there were so many conditions that every mini on the board looked like a Christmas tree by the time it was done, because it would have 7 rings on it, and then you'd say, "Oh, well, it is no longer stunned, so take off the green." Yeah. Oh, but it still has 6 conditions.
Yeah,
It was a condition-full edition,
it was.
to say the least. But, we who have learned that now can take that knowledge forward and say, with fewer conditions, maybe that's something that you could try, in your home games.
Yeah.
Then we get to monsters and critical hits, how to do that. The book has told us before to use the average damage, to make the game go more quickly, but how do you then do critical hits? Well, they say just use the average damage, but roll the dice that you would have rolled for the attack and add it to it, which is a quick and simple way to deal with those questions. What did you think of the improvising damage section?
It's neat. I generally like it. I find it a little duplicative with the work that the trap damage did. It's almost like the
Mhm.
trap section could just refer to, like, choose one table, put it here, and have the traps point to this maybe. As a
Right.
general, here's what fifth edition damage looks like whenever you're dealing with something that isn't a monster. But it's nice. It's a table that gives you damage dice, all d10s, interestingly, and the number of them is then tied to different subjects, like being submerged in lava, being hit by a crashing flying fortress is 18d10,
Yeah.
and hit by falling rubble in a collapsing tunnel is 4010. uh I think that's fine. I know that fifth edition is an edition that wants to sort of say, here's what reality is, right? So stumbling into a vat of acid is 4010. Okay, great. But the reality of, if you look at even Wizards official adventures, is these numbers vary all over the place.
Mhm.
And they often are tiered, surprise, to the level of the characters, right? So if
Right.
you fall into the fire pit and this is a level 1 adventure, it'll do like d6 damage. But if you stumble into a fire pit and you're 5th level, it may do this 2d10 or even more, because that's the way authors do things without even really thinking about it, right? The damage ends up being what it should be. So we do get this next table, which is damage, severity, and level. And here it has the character level, and it talks about, is this supposed to be a setback, dangerous, or deadly? And it's a really interesting range because the deadly level, it is deadly, right? Like first
They
through
don't.
fourth
They're not
level,
messing around.
4d10, right? Or 24d10 for 17th to 20th. I mean, if you roll a maximum of 240 hit points worth of damage, or even the 120 that's in the middle, that's a lot. That is a
Mhm.
lot. So,
Yeah.
um, I do actually like the table a lot. It's surprisingly, it works actually pretty well. Though those deadly spikes can be quite shocking to players. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And then after that, we get the adjudicating areas of effect. So if you're not using a map, but someone casts a line spell that's 60 feet long or a cone that's 30 feet, a 30-foot cone, how do you figure out how many creatures get caught in that? And they suggest this chart called targets and area of effect, where you take the size of the cone or the cube or the radius of the cylinder or sphere or the length of the line and divide it by a certain number, round up, and that's the number of creatures that a character or a monster can catch within that area. And I'm glad it's there, but I would never use it,
Mhm. Yeah.
uh, because I would rather narrate it and give the caster a choice of, make them think it through and narratively say, you can get 4 and you don't get any of your party. You could get 6, but you're also going to get
Yeah.
your rogue and your fighter. Which do you want to do? And that sort of adds a little bit of not even tactical, but narrative
Mhm.
emphasis to the game. And they don't really mention that here, which I wish they would have. But other than that, I think the chart is sort of makes sense and is fine.
Yeah, I mean, something that I try to be cognizant of is that I've met DMs and players who really cannot sort of store spatial information in their brains, right? Because the way that I look at it, and it may be the way you look at it, is in general, when someone says, hey, how many orcs can I hit with my burning hands? I see the 3-dimensional layout of things,
Mhm.
and I go, well, you could probably get these two and pretty easily, but these three if you did this, because that's where this other character is, right? You'd have to get your ally. um but I think that there are those people who can't, they do not store that information in their heads in that way, and so that's
Right.
where maybe this mathematical thing would really work well for them. um and to this sort of abstract description space, you could add some wording to that some people do not
Mhm.
process things spatially. So when you're doing theater of mind, it's important to keep that in mind. Um and and that if you do as a DM, then giving little cues as you talk about things really is helpful, right? The orc charges at you, or the orc charges at you from the left side where they were hiding behind the planter. right? Like that you're giving little cues of what the room is like as you're talking can be really helpful to players to remind them. Um, the goblin leaves the chest. Oh, right, there's a chest there, right, and comes to attack you,
Mm,
right? Okay,
mm,
that kind of thing is very helpful. And we could say, maybe this is a point to say, hey, look, they don't really talk about theater of the mind here, other than this sort of how to abstract area of effects, and that's a fascinating decision that they didn't choose, even though it's not a super miniatures heavy system. They don't choose to really talk specifically about how to run theater of mind.
yep. And then we have a handling mobs section where it says if you have a lot of monsters, rather than having each one attack, you use a little chart to see what they would need to roll to hit a character. And then you just figure out how many of them within the mob actually would hit without rolling dice, which is fine. It's cool.
Mhm.
It's another mathematical thing. But then the example they give is sort of weird to me because it's 8 orcs, surrounding someone. And I'm like, how hard is it to roll for 8 orcs? Uh,
Mhm.
I, okay, 16. Yeah, okay, now we're getting up there, but 8, I think I could handle that.
Mhm.
And the
Yep.
one thing I love to do is if I have a big mob like that and they're all there around something, is I will just have half the number attack, the other half are helping a someone. So you just roll with advantage
Or with
for
advantage,
the
yeah.
ones, and then
Mhm.
you have a better chance of hitting. It makes it a little more interesting, and you're not wasting all those rolls.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's somewhat like rolling 8 dice anyway, though. But
You're
but
rolling 2 at a time. It's
yeah.
fine.
But yeah, I mean, it's there are a lot of folks who create mob systems, and every time I've used them, my players will say, "Yeah, that was fun. Let's not do it again."
Mhm, mhm,
And so I think that's the thing that I would look at adding advice wise to this is just that there's some, it's fun to spice up games with things like, you know, 100 orcs, 50 orcs, right? Like that can be fun, but it's maybe good to gauge, stop and think about how it works because none of these systems work perfectly. Um, and so
mhm,
it's more thinking through what you're going to like for a particular situation, even, and modifying your
mhm.
approaches over time to fit the scenario and just being aware of that.
Yep. So I wanna, like, speed through these other things because some of
Mhm.
them are sort of
Yeah.
self-explanatory, don't mean much. I know that you have written chases and chases
Mhm.
that were actually pretty fun. So what did you think of the chases section?
The chase system is interesting in that it has a whole way that essentially you're going to move, and then you're going to have a number of times in a round that you can move, or a number of times in this situation, in this scene, that you're going to get to be able to dash. And if you hit that maximum, you are now going to be making checks to see whether you get exhaustion. So you can dash a number of times equals the 3 plus your con mod. After that, DC 10 con or exhaustion. And you can instead use your action not to dash, but attacks or spells. And that somewhat becomes part of the problem is that I think Chases as a rule system doesn't quite know whether it's trying to become a metagame or
Mhm,
trying to remain the game. And they're trying to split the difference and put a leg on each side by doing this. I can't say that I fault the design. I might have ended up right there too, you know. But there are a number of situations. I think of folks who ran Waterdeep Dragon Heist. A lot of times, are sort of having their first experience with this, and we're going, "That wasn't really satisfying," or the player just cast Hold Person, and that was the end of
right.
that. But they're supposed to get away actually, and so there. I would have liked some tips about thinking through what it is that your chase is accomplishing. The
Mhm,
best chases, the chases that really I like, are the ones that lean heavily into part of the rules called chase complications. And that's the idea that when you're going through this chase, you are going to roll on your turn a d20, and on a 1 to 10, a complication takes place, and there's a table of these complications. And you're encouraged to make your own. There are a couple of examples there. And that is where it really gets awesome, especially when it's not actually combat oriented, right? So, like, if you have to catch a kid that you know you don't want to attack and take down, or if you're competing against each other. And so, for a great example, is the Eberron adventure that you can find on the DM's Guild called EB07 Song of the Sky. in that adventure, the same writers that created Witchlight worked on this to simulate a competition where you're on levitating soar sleds, so like little discs, kind of Tetris floating discs, but you can fly on it. And you are soaring around a university competing with each other. All the players are. And so you're soaring and doing things, and then stuff happens, like a sudden flock of birds across your path, and you make checks to see how it goes. And those complications are what makes this a really fun story. And so I'd start with something like looking at that adventure to think through your chases and build off of that, rather than just using these dry rules, which can fall apart when your target can be held or anything like that.
Mhm. And with siege equipment, I feel like it sort of has the same problem. Siege equipment's the next one. So we hear
Mhm.
about ballistas and cannons and suspended cauldrons and rams and siege towers and trebuchets and so on. And they, just like with chases, there seems to be this desire to have this separate metagame. But in the long run, the characters and the players want to do what's on their sheet and want to do what they've been trained to do by
Mhm.
the game, which is not attack a tower, which is not attack a keep. It's to attack the people.
Yeah.
And so when you're in a chase, if the chase is you're chasing something and trying to stop it, like what you described was more of a race.
Mhm. True.
But many times when we do a chase scene, it's, well, we're trying to catch someone to hurt them, or we're trying to stay ahead of someone so they don't hurt us. And sieges are the same sort of thing to me. It's like, well, we could attack the ship, or we could do, we could use our whatever it was, a trebuchet, and do 8d10 damage to the captain.
Right.
And we're probably better off doing that.
Yeah.
So it's the scale of what the rules expect is different, but it's still couched in terms that is so stayed to the players that they just think in those smaller kill the enemy terms.
Yeah, I think that siege weapons probably came about again. This fifth edition idea of reality that a trebuchet is 8d10, and that a ship has this many hit points, and you must do X or it doesn't deal over it. What that really means is a battle against a ship takes forever, and
Mhm.
so players aren't going to do that. They're either going to board or they're going to use those weapons to take out the most important person on the ship and be done with it. Because dealing 44 damage to that target could be really good in a lot of levels of play. And Spelljammer suffers from this, and Spelljammer could have cleaned this up and addressed it, but it didn't. And Spelljammer, if you look at the recommendations for what a starting encounter distance might be, I mean, that can be many rounds of absolute useless boredom unless everybody targets everybody. And you don't want that because, I mean, imagine that they were targeting the player that is sitting on the Spelljammer and you're low level and you're taking this 8d10 damage to a player character from several weapons that are on the ship. That's not fun either, right? So it's a problem where the game's trying to be so accurate to itself that then this system just doesn't jive with the play. And what I would have loved to have seen is saying things like, here's what's typical, right? A trebuchet is general 8d10, but hey, there's no manufacturer making these things for the entire, all campaign worlds. Vary them for your scenario and think through what it is that you're trying to do with these ship weapons and what the situation is. Make your own ship weapons that are cool, right? And do different things and do things to engage the players in these types of situations. So I've done things like that the enemy fires at you what looks like to be a catapult, a bunch of rocks, but the rocks, not only do they do some damage to the ship, which is fine, that's not the point. The point is these rocks turn out to be a bunch of skeletons that reassemble once they hit the ship. So it's like a bone catapult spray, and then they assemble and now fight people, and now that's kind of fun and engaging while you still can have the ship battle or things like that, right? And so that's where siege weapons, I think, end up really harming the game because they create this weird stated rule set that doesn't apply to a lot of different levels of play, even though you wish it did.
I want to cover diseases, poisons, and madness all as one thing.
Mm-hmm.
because for me, it comes down to sort of what we talked about when we answered that question originally, which was, how do you do these other things and make it fun? And the answer is often not well.
Yeah.
Because D&D is a game about removing hit points from the enemy before the enemy removes hit points from you. So to add these diseases, poison, madness, it's sort of a system that's tacked on that is either way too powerful or
Yeah.
totally inconsequential. There's rarely anything fun or interesting about it in terms of gameplay, unless you tailor it specifically to the situation that your players are in.
Right.
Then it can become fun. Okay, you have this disease and you need to get the cure for it, which is in this place over here.
Yes.
And you have 4 days to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And after 5 days, the person is deteriorating along the way. Okay, that can be made fun. But if it's just a 5 days, but a cure disease from a 3rd level cleric, which after your 5th level, everybody a 3rd level spell, which everybody has, then it sort of doesn't work over the length and breadth of the entire game. And for me, it's the same thing with poison and the same thing with madness. It doesn't fit.
And Madness has a number of problems in today's game that 2014 folks, designers of all companies, not just Wizards, are not really thinking through. And I think that you can sidestep a lot of these problems if you aren't trying to recreate the world and reality as poisons and madness and diseases are trying to do. And you look at the application and say, hey, in a situation where you can't think clearly, how can you model that? And why are you modeling it? Why is it fun? Why is it interesting? Why is it engaging to be poisoned, to be unable to think clearly in some way, right? How do we make that interesting and fun? How can we make it interesting and fun to be diseased? What is that key thing that's engaging you in the game? And they don't seem to answer that here. And then the system and the method is just so again, it's so fixed on a particular view of how things should work that it isn't fun. I mean, nobody wants to have their character be completely out of control for 20 minutes or longer because we don't even know what the gameplay application is. Am I just hand waving it and traveling a day, or am I in combat for the next however long? Those are such different applications that it just doesn't work as a system of trying to create the truth of the game. Yeah.
And last but not least, we hear about experience points and how to handle them, why to use them, why not to. This is an interesting discussion, because I think most of the people, or at least most of the people that designed 5th edition originally, don't use XP and haven't for forever, because of all the problems that come with experience points in terms of creating games, in terms of being a DM and planning a campaign. But they still need to put this in there to tell people how it used to be, or how some people like to play, maybe. I don't know.
And I think
what do you think?
I think they do a disservice. They're trying to do that, but I think they do a disservice even to that goal. They should really say, I mean, the reality is some people love XP. And we see this on our Patreon Discord, where a number of people will talk about how much they love XP. You and I don't. That's fine. People do. Some DMs do, some players do. A lot of my players would prefer that I use XP. I don't want the micromanaging, so I just say, sorry, folks, you're not getting that little tickle of fun from me that says you're about to level. But understanding those differences a little better than what they say here, and then why they suggest these different systems. So they talk about, absent characters and non-combat challenges. And then they talk about like, hey, you can measure the XP, based on the monster rules and so on. But you can also do milestones where completing a goal grants XP. And they do that in a confusing enough way that a lot of folks will think that milestones is the idea of just leveling with what's called really story-based advancement, which they also talk about here, or session-based, right? You could advance every session, or you could advance based on the story itself. We've cleaned out the temple can be the story point. It can also be a milestone, but the milestone is really more of a fourth edition view of saying, you are hired by the lord of the castle. She tells you to go clear out the cult. When you do that, you almost cash it in, right? Video game style, and get this bundle of XP versus, and it's an XP value versus level advancement without XP, where you say, when you've cleared out the cultists, you're second level. I'm not tracking numbers. It's just happened.
Right.
And I think it would be nice if it tried to be a little less neutral about it and more say, here's why this system's great, here's its shortcomings, and then explain that, well, there's no perfect system for all people. You choose the one you like and go with that.
Yep. Agreed. Hey, we made it. We made it through chapter 9 or chapter 8. Now we can go on to chapter 9, the Dungeon Master's Workshop, where we can get our hands dirty with building things based on Wizards of the Coast telling us how to build. So we'll see if their blueprints pass muster. Well, Teos, I know that you're exhausted, so I want to thank you for hanging in there and doing such a fine job.
I'm what were you talking? I was just sitting here thinking about the Duke football victory over Clemson, but no, I'm not kidding.
I was going to mention that.
I had to find a way to bring it up.
Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you for being here, and thank you to all our listeners out there for hanging in there while we yak on.
I did want to say thank you to several folks who came up at PAX. I think the funniest was you looked like Teos, but then I heard you speak, and I was like, oh, that's the Teos I hear every week. That really made me feel quite honored that my voice could be recognized by someone. Was amazing. And there was a father-son duo who came up and talked about listening to the show, and the kid just looking at his dad and just matter-of-factly going, yeah, I really like that show. I mean, really warmed my heart. So thank you, everybody who listens, and to those folks who sometimes get the opportunity to say that to us in person. It really means a lot to us. Thank you.
It really does. So thank you. And thank you to our patrons who support us. Thank you, Master of Dungeon supporters. We do appreciate your support. Thank you to our Master of Realm supporters. They get a shout out in our show notes, but the Masters of the Multiverse, well, they get this. They get Graham Ward, James Walton, Joe Tyler, Krishna Simose, Andy Shockney, Ross Sandberg, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Vladimir Prenner from Croatia, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Falcon Neal, Sean Molly, the Micro Ant, Eric Mengi, the Mathemagician, Chad Lynch, Jim Klingler, aka DM Prime Mover, Brian King, Go Lions, Chad Jackson, Sean Hurst, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, The Mighty Jerd, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Seth Eckel, Darren Chandler, DM Chad, Evil John, Merrick Blackman, Steve Bissonette, Craig Bailey, and Keith Ammon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing. Thank you all for being supporters, and you, yes, you, could become a patron of our show by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd. We do appreciate that, and you get access to the Discord server where a lot of these great discussions are happening, just like they do on the show, only with a lot more smart people. If you get the chance, you can also review us on Apple Podcasts or subscribe to us via YouTube. Teos, where can people find you, man?
Well, no longer at PAX. You can find me at alphastream.org. I will hopefully, I've come up for air, and I think I can now provide something fun will come up this next week.
Yeah.
What about you, Shawn?
And I am on Twitter. I am on Blue Sky now. I am on Tabletop Social via Mastodon, elsewhere, Facebook, running around my town screaming. Sometimes.
We've
haven't
talked
been
about
arrested
that,
for it
Shawn.
yet. I know. And of course, on our Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel. So Teos, we've made it through learning how to run D&D at the table. What are we going to do now?
Oh, well, I'm just gonna go hang out and look at my awesome issue my Phandelver below the shattered obelisk. Wow,
Yeah.
this is
Uh-huh.
great. This is so
Yeah.
good. So
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. And I am going to run around town screaming.